The Forbidden by Clive Barker. Like a flawless tragedy, the elegance of which structure is lost upon those suffering in it, the perfect geometry of the Spectre Street estate was visible only from the air, walking in its drear canyons, passing through its grimy corridors from one grey concrete rectangle to the next. There was little to seduce the eye or stimulate the imagination. What few saplings had been planted in the quadrangles had long since been mutilated or uprooted. The grass, though tall, resolutely refused a healthy green. No doubt the estate and its two companion developments had once been an architect's dream. No doubt the city planners had wept with pleasure at a design that housed 36 persons per hectare, and still boasted space for a children's playground. Doubtless fortunes and reputations had been built upon Spectre Street, and at its opening fine words had been spoken of its being a yardstick by which all future developments would be measured. But the planners, tears wept, words spoken, had left the estate to its own devices. The architects occupied restored Georgian houses at the other end of the city, and probably never set foot here. They would not have been shamed by the deterioration of the estate, even if they had. Their brainchild, they would doubtless argue, was as brilliant as ever, its geometries as precise, its ratios as calculated. It was people who had spoiled Spectre Street. Nor would they have been wrong in such an accusation. Helen had seldom seen an inner-city environment so comprehensively vandalized. Lamps had been shattered, and backyard fences overthrown. Cars whose wheels and engines had been removed and chassis then burned blocked garage facilities. In one courtyard, 3 or 4 ground-floor maisonettes had been entirely gutted by fire, their windows and doors boarded up with planks and corrugated metal shutters. More startling still was the graffiti. That was what she had come here to see, encouraged by Archie's talk of the place. And she was not disappointed. It was difficult to believe, staring at the multiple layers of designs, names, obscenities, and dogmas that were scrawled and sprayed on every available brick, that Spectre Street was barely 3.5 years old. The walls, so recently virgin, were now so profoundly defaced that the council cleaning department could never hope to return them to their former condition. A layer of whitewash to cancel this visual cacophony would only offer the scribes a fresh and yet more tempting surface on which to make their mark. Helen was in seventh heaven. Every corner she turned offered some fresh material for her thesis, graffiti, the semiotics of urban despair. It was a subject that married her two favorite disciplines, sociology and aesthetics. And as she wandered around the estate, she began to wonder if there wasn't a book in addition to her thesis in the subject. She walked from courtyard to courtyard, copying down a large number of the more interesting scrawlings and noting their location. Then she went back to the car for her camera and tripod and returned to the most fertile of the areas to make a thorough visual record of the walls. It was a chilly business. She was not an expert photographer, and the late October sky was in full flight, shifting the light on the bricks from one moment to the next. As she adjusted and readjusted the exposure to compensate for the light changes, her fingers steadily became clumsier, her temper correspondingly thinner, but she struggled on, the idle curiosity of passers-by notwithstanding. There were so many designs to document, She reminded herself that her present discomfort would be amply repaid when she showed the slides to Trevor, whose doubt of the project's validity had been perfectly apparent from the beginning. "The writing on the wall?" he'd said, half smiling in that irritating fashion of his. "It has been done 100 times. This was true, of course, and yet not. There certainly were learned works on graffiti, chock full of sociological jargon, cultural disenfranchisement, urban alienation, but she flattered herself that she might find something among this litter of scrawlings that previous analysts had not, some unifying convention perhaps that she could use as the linchpin of her thesis. Only a vigorous cataloging and cross-referencing of the phrases and images before her would reveal such a correspondence, hence the importance of this photographic study. So many hands had worked here, so many minds left their mark, however casually. If she could find some pattern, some predominant motive or motif, the thesis would be guaranteed some serious attention, and so in turn would she. "What are you doing?" a voice from behind her asked. She turned her calculations to see a young woman with a stroller on the pavement behind her. She looked weary, Helen thought, and pinched by the cold. The child in the stroller was mewling, his grimy fingers clutching an orange lollipop and the wrapping from a chocolate bar. The bulk of the chocolate and the remains of previous jujubes were displayed down the front of his coat. Helen offered a thin smile to the woman. She looked in need of it. "I'm photographing the walls," she said, in answer to the initial inquiry, though surely this was perfectly apparent. The woman, she could barely be 20, Helen judged, said, "You mean the filth?" "The writing and the pictures," Helen said. Then, "Yes, the filth." "You from the council?" "No, the university." "It's bloody disgusting," the woman said. "The way they do that. It's not just kids either." "No, grown men too. They don't give a damn. Do it in broad daylight. You see 'em, broad daylight." She glanced down at the child, who was sharpening his lollipop on the ground. "Carrie," she snapped, but the boy took no notice. "Are they going to wipe it off?" she asked. "I don't know," Helen said, and reiterated, "I'm from the university." "Oh," the woman replied, as if this were new information. "So you're nothing to do with the council?" "No." "Some of it's obscene, isn't it? Really dirty. Makes me embarrassed to see some of the things they draw." Helen nodded, casting an eye at the boy in the stroller. Gary had decided to put his lollipop in his ear for safekeeping. "Don't do that," his mother told him, and leaned over to slap the child's hand. The blow, which was negligible, started the child bawling. Helen took the opportunity to return to her camera. But the woman still desired to talk. "It's not just on the outside, neither," she commented. "I beg your pardon?" Helen said. "They break into the flats when they get vacant. The council tried to board them up, but it does no good. They break in anyway, use them as toilets, and write more filth on the walls. They light fires, too. Then nobody can move back in." The description piqued Helen's curiosity. Would the graffiti on the inside walls be substantially different from the public displays? It was certainly worth an investigation. "Are there any places you know of around here like that?" "Empty flats, you mean?" "With graffiti." "Just by us, there's one or two," the woman volunteered. "I'm in Butt's Court." "Maybe you could show me," Helen asked. The woman shrugged. "By the way, my name's Helen Buchanan. Anne-Marie, the woman replied. I'd be very grateful if you could point me to one of those empty flats. Anne-Marie was baffled by Helen's enthusiasm and made no attempt to disguise it, but she shrugged again and said, There's nothing much to see, only more of the same stuff. Helen gathered up her equipment, and they walked side by side through the intersecting corridors between one square and the next. Though the estate was low-rise, each court only 5 stories high, the effect of each quadrangle was horribly claustrophobic. The walkways and staircases were a thief's dream, rife with blind corners and ill-lit tunnels. The rubbish dumping facilities, chutes from the upper floors down which bags of refuse could be pitched, had long since been sealed up, thanks to their efficiency as fire traps. Now plastic bags of refuse were piled high in the corridors, many torn open by roaming dogs, their contents strewn across the ground. The smell, even in the cold weather, was unpleasant. In high summer, it must have been overpowering. I'm over the other side, Anne-Marie said, pointing across the quadrangle. The one with the yellow door. She then pointed along the opposite side of the court. 5 or 6 maisonettes from the end, she said. There's 2 of them been emptied out. Few weeks now. One of the families moved into Ruskin Court. The other did a bunk in the middle of the night. With that, she turned her back on Helen and wheeled Carrie, who had taken to trailing spittle from the side of his stroller, around the side of the square. Thank you, Helen called after her. Anne-Marie glanced over her shoulder briefly but did not reply. Appetite whetted, Helen made her way along the row of ground-floor maisonettes, many of which, though inhabited, showed little sign of being so. Their curtains were closely drawn. There were no milk bottles on the doorsteps or children's toys left where they had been played with. Nothing, in fact, of life here. There were more graffiti, however, sprayed, shockingly, on the doors of occupied houses. She granted the scrawlings only a casual perusal, in part because she feared that one of the doors might open as she examined a choice obscenity sprayed upon it, but more because she was eager to see what revelations the empty flats ahead might offer. The malign scent of urine, both fresh and stale, welcomed her at the threshold of number 14, and beneath that the smell of burnt paint and plastic. She hesitated for fully 10 seconds, wondering if stepping into the maisonette was a wise move. The territory of the estate behind her was indisputably foreign, sealed off in its own misery, but the rooms in front of her were more intimidating still. A dark maze which her eyes could barely penetrate. But when her courage faltered, she thought of Trevor and how badly she wanted to silence his condescension. So, thinking, she advised into the place, deliberately kicking a piece of charred timber aside as she did so, in the hope that she would alert any tenant into showing himself. There was no sound of occupancy, however. Gaining confidence, she began to explore the front room of the maisonette, which had been, to judge by the remains of disemboweled sofa in one corner and the sodden carpet underfoot, a living room. The pale green walls were, as Anne-Marie had promised, extensively defaced, both by minor scribbles, content to work in pen, or even more crudely, in soft charcoal, and by those with aspirations to public works who had sprayed the walls in half a dozen colors. Some of the comments were of interest, though many she had already seen on the walls outside. Familiar names and couplings repeated themselves. Though she had never set eyes on these individuals, she knew how badly Fabian J. A.O.K. wanted to deflower Michelle, and that Michelle, in her turn, had the hots for somebody called Mr. Sheen. Here as elsewhere, a man called White Rag boasted of his endowment, and the return of the Syllabub brothers was promised in red paint. One or two of the pictures accompanying, or at least adjacent to these phrases, were of particular interest. An almost emblematic simplicity informed them. Beside the words Christos was a stick man, with his hair radiating from his head, like spines, and other heads impaled on each spine. Close by was an image of intercourse so brutally reduced that at first Helen took it to illustrate a knife plunging into a sightless eye. But fascinating as the images were, the room was too gloomy for her film, and she had neglected to bring a flash. If she wanted a reliable record of these discoveries, she would have to come again, and for now be content with a simple exploration of the premises. The maisonette wasn't that large, but the windows had been boarded up throughout, and as she moved farther from the front door, the dubious light petered out altogether. The smell of urine, which had been strong at the door, intensified too, until by the time she reached the back of the living room and stepped along a short corridor into another room beyond, it was as cloying as incense. This room, being farthest from the front door, was also the darkest, and she had to wait a few moments in the cluttered gloom to allow her eyes to become useful. This, she guessed, had been the bedroom, and what little furniture the residents had left behind them had been smashed to smithereens. Only the mattress had been left relatively untouched, dumped in the corner of the room among a wretched litter of blankets, newspapers, and pieces of crockery. Outside, the sun found its way between the clouds, and 2 or 3 shafts of sunlight slipped between the boards nailed across the bedroom window and pierced the room like annunciations, scoring the opposite wall with bright lines. Here the graffitiist had been busy once more, the usual clamor of love letters and threats. She scanned the wall quickly, and as she did so, her eye was led by the beams of light across the room to the wall that contained the door she had stepped through. Here, the artists had also been at work, but had produced an image the like of which she had not seen anywhere else. Using the door, which was centrally placed in the wall like a mouth, the artists had sprayed a single vast head onto the stripped plaster. The painting was more adroit than most she had seen, rife with detail that lent the image an unsettling veracity, the cheekbones jutting through skin the color of buttermilk, the teeth sharpened to irregular points, all converging on the door. The sitter's eyes were owing to the room's low ceiling and set mere inches above the upper lip. But in this physical adjustment, only lent force to the image, giving the impression that he had thrown his head back. Knotted strands of his hair snaked from his scalp across the ceiling. Was it a portrait? There was something naggingly specific in the details of the brows and the lines around the wide mouth, in the careful picturing of those vicious teeth. A nightmare, certainly. A facsimile, perhaps, of something from a heroine fugue. Whatever its origins, it was potent. Even the illusion of Dora's mouth worked. The short passageway between living room and bedroom offered a passable throat, with a tattered lamp in lieu of tonsils. Beyond the gullet, the day burned white in the nightmare's belly. The whole effect brought to mind a ghost train painting, the same heroic deformity. the same unashamed intention to scare. And it worked. She stood in the bedroom almost stupefied by the picture, its red-rimmed eyes fixing her mercilessly. Tomorrow, she determined, she would come here again, this time with high-speed film and a flash to illuminate the masterwork. As she prepared to leave, the sun went in, and the bands of light faded. She glanced over her shoulder at the boarded windows and saw for the first time that one 4-word slogan had been sprayed on the wall beneath them. "Sweets to the sweet," it read. She was familiar with the quote, but not with its source. Was it a profession of love? If so, it was an odd location for such an avowal. Despite the mattress in the corner and the relative privacy of this room, she could not imagine the intended reader of such words ever stepping in here to receive her bouquet. No adolescent lovers, however heated, would lie down here to play at mothers and fathers, not under the gaze of the terror on the wall. She crossed to examine the writing. The paint looked to be the same shade of pink as had been used to color the gums of the screaming man. Perhaps the same hand. Behind her, a noise. She turned so quickly she almost tripped over the blanket-strewn mattress. Who? At the other end of the gullet, in the living room, was a scab-kneed boy of 6 or 7. He stared at Helen, eyes glittering in the half-light, as if waiting for a cue. "Yes," she said. "Anne-Marie says, do you want a cup of tea?" he declared without pause or intonation. Her conversation with the woman seemed hours past. She was grateful for the invitation, however. The damp in the maisonette had chilled her. "Yes," she said to the boy. "Yes, please." The child didn't move, but simply stared at her. "Are you going to lead the way?" she asked him. "If you want," he replied, unable to raise a trace of enthusiasm. "I'd like that." "You taking photographs?" he asked. Yes, I am, but not in here." "Why not?" "It's too dark," she told him. "Don't it work in the dark?" He wanted to know. "No." The boy nodded at this, as if the information somehow fitted well into his scheme of things, and about turned without another word, clearly expecting Helen to follow. If she had been taciturn in the street, Anne-Marie was anything but in the privacy of her own kitchen. Gone was the guarded curiosity, to be replaced by a stream of lively chatter and a constant scurrying between 6 minor domestic tasks, like a juggler keeping several plates spinning simultaneously. Helen watched this balancing act with some admiration. Her own domestic skills were negligible. At last, the meandering conversation turned back to the subject that had brought Helen here. "Them photographs," Anne-Marie said. "Why'd you want to take 'em?" "I'm writing about graffiti. The photos will illustrate my thesis." "It's not very pretty." "No, you're right, it isn't, but I find it interesting." Anne-Marie shook her head. "I hate the whole estate," she said. "It's not safe here. People getting robbed on their own doorsteps, kids setting fire to the rubbish day in, day out. Last summer we had the fire brigade here 2-3 times a day, till they sealed them chutes off. Now people just dump the bags in the passageways, and that attracts rats." "Do you live here alone?" "Yes," she said, "since Davy walked out." "Is that your husband?" "He was Carrie's father, but we weren't never married. We lived together 2 years, we had some good times. Then he just up and went off one day when I was at me mams with Carrie." She peered into her teacup. "I'm better off without him," she said, "but you get scared sometimes. Want some more tea?" think I've got time?" "Just a cup," Anne-Marie said, already up and unplugging the electric kettle to take it to the sink for a refill. As she was about to turn on the tap, she saw something on the draining board and drove her thumb down, grinding it out. "Got you, you bugger," she said, then turned to Helen. "We got these bloody ants." "Ants?" "Whole estate's infected. From Egypt they are. Pharaoh ants, they are called. Little brown sods. They breed in the central heating ducts, you see. That way they get into all the flats. Place is plagued with them." This unlikely exoticism, ants from Egypt, struck Helen as comical, but she said nothing. Anne-Marie was staring out of the kitchen window and into the backyard. "You should tell him," she said, though Helen wasn't certain whom she was being instructed to tell. "Tell him that ordinary people can't even walk the streets anymore." "Is it really so bad?" Helen said, frankly tiring of this catalogue of misfortunes. Anne-Marie turned from the sink and looked at her hard. "We've had murders here," she said. "Really?" "We had one in the summer. An old man he was from Ruskin. Now, I didn't know him, but he was a friend of the sister of the woman next door. I forget his name. And he was murdered. Cut to ribbons in his own front room. They didn't find him for almost a week." "What about his neighbors? Didn't they notice his absence?" Anne-Marie shrugged, as if the most important pieces of information, the murder and the man's isolation, had been divulged and any further inquiries into the problem were irrelevant. But Helen pressed the point. "Seems strange to me," she said. Anne-Marie plugged in the filled kettle. "Well, it happened," she replied, unmoved. "I'm not saying it didn't. His eyes had been taken out," she said, before Helen could voice any further doubts. Helen winced. "No," she said under her breath. "That's the truth," Anne-Marie said, "and that wasn't all that'd been done to him." She paused for effect, then went on. "You wonder what kind of person's capable of doing things like that, don't you? You wonder." Helen nodded. She was thinking precisely the same thing. "Did they ever find the man responsible?" Anne-Marie snorted her disparagement. "Police don't give a damn what happens here. They keep off the estate as much as possible. When they do patrol, all they do is pick up kids for getting drunk and that. They're afraid, you see. That's why they keep clear." "Of this killer?" "Maybe," Anne-Marie replied. Then, "He had a hook." "A hook?" "The man what done it. He had a hook like Jack the Ripper." Helen was no expert on murder, but she felt certain that the Ripper hadn't boasted a hook. It seemed churlish to question the truth of Anne-Marie's story, however, though she silently wondered how much of this, the eyes taken out, the body rotting in the flat, the hook, was elaboration. The most scrupulous of reporters was surely tempted to embellish a story once in a while. Anne-Marie had poured herself another cup of tea and was about to do the same for her guest. "No, thank you," Helen said. "I really should go." "You married?" Anne-Marie asked, out of the blue. "Yes, to a lecturer from the university." "What's his name?" "Trevor." Anne-Marie put 2 heaped spoonfuls of sugar into her cup of tea. "Will you be coming back?" she asked. "Yes, I hope so. Later in the week. I want to take some photographs of the pictures in the maisonette across the court." "Well, call in." "I shall, and thank you for your help." "That's all right," Anne-Marie replied. "You've got to tell somebody, haven't you?" The man apparently had a hook instead of a hand. Trevor looked up from his plate of tagliatelle con prosciutto. Beg your pardon? Helen had been at pains to keep her recounting of this story as uncolored by her own response as she could. She was interested to know what Trevor would make of it, and she knew that if she once signaled her own stance, he would instinctively take an opposing view out of plain bloody mindedness. He had a hook, she repeated, without inflection. Trevor put down his fork and plucked at his nose, sniffing. I didn't read anything about this, he said. You don't read the local papers, Helen returned. Neither of us do. Maybe it never made any of the nationals. Geriatric, murdered by hook-handed maniac? Trevor said, savoring the hyperbole. I would have thought it very newsworthy. When was all of this supposed to have happened? Sometime last summer. Maybe we were in Ireland. Maybe, said Trevor, taking up his fork again. Bending to his food, the polished lens of his spectacles reflected only the plate of pasta and chopped ham in front of him, not his eyes. Why do you say maybe? Helen prodded. Doesn't sound quite right, he said. In fact, it sounds bloody preposterous. You don't believe it, Helen said. Trevor looked up from his food, tongue rescuing a speck of tagliatelle from the corner of his mouth. His face had relaxed into that non-committal expression of his, the same face he wore, no doubt, when listening to his students. Do you believe it? He asked Helen. It was a favorite time-gaining device of his, another seminar trick, to question the questioner. I'm not sure, Helen replied, too concerned with finding some solid ground in this sea of doubts to waste energy scoring points. All right, forget the tale, Trevor said, deserting his food for another glass of red wine. What about the teller? Did you trust her? Helen pictured Anne-Marie's earnest expression as she told the story of the old man's murder. Yes, she said. Yes, I think I would have known if she'd been lying to me. So, why is it so important anyhow? I mean, whether she's lying or not, what the fuck does it matter? It was a reasonable question, if irritatingly put. Why did it matter? Was it that she wanted to have her worst feelings about Spectre Street proved false? That such an estate, be filthy, be hopeless, be a dump where the undesirable and the disadvantaged were tucked out of public view, all that was a liberal commonplace, and she accepted it as an unpalatable social reality. But the story of the old man's murder and mutilation was something other, an image of violent death that, once with her, refused to part from her company. She realized to her chagrin that this confusion was plain on her face, and that Trevor, watching her across the table, was not a little entertained by it. If it bothers you so much, he said, why don't you go back there and ask around instead of playing Believe It or Not over dinner? She couldn't help but rise to his remark. I thought you liked guessing games, she said. He threw her a sullen look. Wrong. Again, he said. The suggestion that she investigate was not a bad one, though doubtless he had ulterior motives for offering it. She viewed Trevor less charitably day by day. What she had once thought in him a fierce commitment to debate, she now recognized as mere power play. He argued, not for the thrill of dialectic, but because he was pathologically competitive. She had seen him, time and again, take up attitudes she knew he did not espouse, simply to spill blood. No, more's the pity, was he alone in this sport. Academe was one of the last strongholds of the professional time-waster. On occasion their circle seemed entirely dominated by educated fools, lost in a wasteland of stale rhetoric and hollow commitment. From one wasteland to another. She returned to Spectre Street the following day, armed with a flash gun, in addition to her tripod and high-sensitivity film. The wind was up today, and it was arctic, more furious still for being trapped in a maze of passageways and courts. She made her way to number 14 and spent the next hour in its befouled confines, meticulously photographing both the bedroom and living room walls. She had half expected the impact of the head in the bedroom to be dulled by reacquaintance. It was not, though she struggled to capture its scale and detail as best she could. She knew the photographs would be at best a dim echo of its perpetual howl. Much of its power lay in its context, of course. That such an image might be stumbled upon in surroundings so drab, so conspicuously lacking in mystery, was akin to finding an icon on a rubbish heap, a gleaming symbol of transcendence from a world of toil and decay into some darker but more tremendous realm. She was painfully aware that the intensity of her response probably defied her articulation. Her vocabulary was analytic, replete with buzzwords and academic terminology, but woefully impoverished when it came to evocation. The photographs, pale as they would be, would, she hoped, at least hint at the potency of this picture, even if they couldn't conjure up the way it froze their bowels. When she emerged from the maisonette, the wind was as uncharitable as ever. But the boy waiting outside, the same child as had attended upon her yesterday, was dressed as if for spring weather. He grimaced in his effort to keep the shudders at bay. "Hello," Helen said.
"I waited,"
the child announced. "Waited?"
"Anne-Marie said you'd come back."
"I wasn't planning to come until later in the week," Helen said. "You might have waited a long time." The boy's grimace relaxed a notch.
"It's all right," he said. "I got nothing to do."
"What about school?"
"Don't like it,"
the boy replied, as if not obliged to be educated if it wasn't to his taste. "I see," said Helen, and began to walk down the side of the quadrangle. The boy followed. On the patch of grass at the center of the quadrangle, several chairs and 2 or 3 dead saplings had been piled. "What's this?" she asked, half to herself.
"Bonfire night,"
the boy informed her.
"Next week."
"Of course."
"You going to see Anne-Marie?"
he asked. "Yes."
"She's not in."
"Oh, are you sure?"
"Yeah."
"Well, perhaps you can help me." She stopped and turned to face the child. Smooth sacks of fatigue hung beneath his eyes. "I heard about an old man who was murdered near here," she said to him, "in the summer. Do you know anything about that?"
"No."
"Nothing at all? You don't remember anybody getting killed?"
"No,"
the boy said, again with impressive finality.
"I don't remember."
"Well, thank you anyway." This time, when she retraced her steps back to the car, the boy didn't follow. But as she turned the corner out of the quadrangle, she glanced back to see him standing on the spot where she'd left him, staring after her as if she were a madwoman. By the time she had reached the car and packed the photographic equipment into the trunk, there were specks of rain in the wind, and she was sorely tempted to forget she'd ever heard Anne-Marie's story and make her way home, where the coffee would be warm, even if the welcome wasn't. But she needed an answer to the question Trevor had put the previous night. "Do you believe it?" he'd asked. When she told him the story, she hadn't known how to answer then, and she still didn't. Perhaps, why did she sense this? The terminology of verifiable truth was redundant here. Perhaps the final answer to his question was not an answer at all, only another question. If so. She had to find out. Ruskin Court was as forlorn as its fellows, if not more so. It didn't even boast a bonfire. On the third-floor balcony, a woman was taking washing in before the rain broke. On the grass in the center of the quadrangle, 2 dogs were absent-mindedly rutting, the Faki staring up at the blank sky. As she walked along the empty pavement, she set her face determinedly. A purposeful look. Bernadette had once said, "Deterred attack," when she caught sight of 2 women talking at the far end of the court. She crossed over to them hurriedly, grateful for their presence. "Excuse me." The women, both middle-aged, ceased their animated exchange and looked her over. "I wonder if you can help me." She could feel their appraisal and their distrust. They went undisguised. One of the pair, her face florid, said plainly, "What do you want?" Helen suddenly felt bereft of the least power to charm. What was she to say to these 2 that wouldn't make her motives appear ghoulish? "I was told," she began, and then stumbled, aware that she would get no assistance from either woman. "I was told there'd been a murder here. Is that right?" The florid woman raised eyebrows so plucked they were barely visible. "Murder?" she said. "Are you from the press?" the other woman inquired. The years had soured her features beyond sweetening. Her small mouth was deeply lined. Her hair, which had been dyed brunette, showed a half-inch of gray at the roots. "No, I'm not from the press," Helen said. "I'm a friend of Anne-Marie's in Butt's Court." This claim of friend stretched the truth, but it seemed to mellow the women somewhat. "Visiting, are you?" the florid woman asked. "In a manner of speaking. You missed the warm spell. Anne-Marie was telling me about somebody who'd been murdered here during the summer. I was curious about it." "Is that right? Do you know anything about it?" "Lots of things go on around here," said the second woman. "You don't know the half of it." "So it's true?" Helen said. "They had to close the toilets," the first woman put in. "That's right, they did," the other said. "The toilets," Helen said. What had this to do with the old man's death? "It was terrible," the first said. "Was it your Frank, Josie, who told you about it?" "No, not Frank," Josie replied. "Frank was still at sea. It was Mrs. Tazak." The witness established, Josie relinquished the story to her companion and turned her gaze back upon Helen. The suspicion had not yet died from her eyes. "This was only a month before last," Josie said. "Just about the end of August. It was August, wasn't it?" She looked to the other woman for verification. "You've got the head for dates, Maureen." Maureen looked uncomfortable. "I forget," she said, clearly unwilling to offer testimony. "I'd like to know," Helen said. Josie, despite her companion's reluctance, was eager to oblige.
There's some lavatories, she said, outside the shops, public lavatories. I'm not quite sure how it all happened exactly, but there used to be a boy. Well, he wasn't a boy, really. I mean, he was a man of 20 or more, but he was, she fished for the words, mentally subnormal, I suppose you'd say. His mother used to have to take him around like he was a 4-year-old. Anyhow, she let him go into the lavatories when they went to that little supermarket. What's it called?
She turned to Maureen for prompting, but the other woman just looked back, her disapproval plain. Josie was ungovernable, however.
Broad daylight this was, she said to Helen. Middle of the day. Anyhow, the boy went to the toilet and the mother was in the shop. And after a while, how you do, she's busy shopping. She forgets about him. And then she thinks he's been gone a long time.
At this juncture, Maureen couldn't prevent herself from butting in. The accuracy of the story apparently took precedence over her wariness.
She got into an argument, she corrected Josie, with the manager about some bad bacon she'd had from him. That was why she was such a time.
I see, said Helen.
Anyway, said Josie, picking up the tale, she finished her shopping, and when she came out, he still wasn't there. So she asked someone from the supermarket.
Maureen began, but Josie wasn't about to have her narrative snatched away at this vital juncture.
She asked one of the men from the supermarket,
she repeated over Maureen's interjection,
to go down into the lavatory and find him.
It was terrible, said Maureen, clearly picturing the atrocity in her mind's eye.
He was lying on the floor in a pool of blood.
Murdered?
Josie shook her head. He'd have been better off dead. He'd been attacked with a razor.
She let this piece of information sink in before delivering the coup de grace.
And they'd cut off his private parts. Just cut him off and flushed him down the toilet. No reason on earth to do it.
Oh, my God.
Better off dead, Josie repeated. I mean, they can't mend something like that, can they?
The appalling tale was rendered worse still by the sang-froid of the teller and the casual repetition of better off dead. The boy, Helen said, was he able to describe his attacker?
No, said Josie. He's practically an imbecile. He can't string more than 2 words together.
And nobody saw anyone go into the lavatory or leaving it.
People come and go all the time,
Maureen said. This, though it sounded like an adequate explanation, had not been Helen's experience. There was not a great bustle in the quadrangle and passageways, far from it. Perhaps the shopping mall was busier, she reasoned, and might offer adequate cover for such a crime. So they haven't found the culprit? She said.
No,
Josie replied, her eyes losing their fervor. The crime and its immediate consequences were the nub of this story. She had little or no interest in either the culprit or his capture.
We're not safe in our own bed, Maureen observed. You ask anyone.
Anne-Marie said the same, Helen replied. That's how she came to tell me about the old man. Said he was murdered during the summer, here, in Ruskin Court.
I do remember something,
Josie said.
There was some talk I heard. An old man and his dog, he was battered to death, and the dog ended up, I don't know. It certainly wasn't here. It must have been one of the other estates.
Are you sure? The woman looked offended by this slur on her memory.
Oh, yes, she said. I mean, if it had been here, we'd have known the story, wouldn't we?